Contained but Unrestrained by Fuck Yeah Gallavich. Chapter 1, Reunion. Ian had just set his belongings on the unmade top bunk when the screech of the door scraping open jarred him from a thoughtless trance. Ian prepared himself for whoever, entered his new cell. He cursed silently at the pitiful amount of time he'd been given to acclimate to his new surroundings, bit the metaphoric bullet, and turned around. He damn near rubbed his eyes like a goddamn cartoon character, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on his fragile mind, because there was no fucking way in hell that was Mickey. His Mickey fucking Milkovich, standing in front of him with a knowing grin pulling at his cheek and glinting in his eyes. The door slammed shut behind him, and Mickey stood there looking just so goddamn smug, so goddamn pleased with himself, so goddamn beautiful. Ian could not form words, but even if he could, he had no idea what to say or how to feel. Mickey was locked up again. For a little over a year now, Ian imagined Mickey free in Mexico, cautious, but free. He had fully convinced himself that Mickey was free, and now being so happy to see him here locked up again. Ian knew it was bullshit, and yet, goddamn him, he was elated. Before he could decide on what question to ask first, though he had settled on, "What the fuck are you doing here?" Mickey blurted out, "I rolled on the cartel I was working for, and in exchange, guess who gets to pick where he gets locked up?" All the air burst out of Ian's lungs at once. "Holy fuck," Ian gasped in response. That's why his son of a bitch looked so goddamn smug. He fucking planned this. How? He was still confused about how all of this had come to be, but he decided in that instant that he didn't care. No matter how much time he had with Mickey Milkovich, this man would always manage to surprise him. Mickey's smirk somehow grew simultaneously more smug and softened to simple happiness. There was a brief silence before Mickey, rarely one for squishy moments, especially not by his design, snapped to business and gestured to the bottom bunk, already prepared for an occupant. "Oh, hey, I got bottom," Mickey said with a straight face as he crossed Ian's path, but a small smile broke through the mask of calm as he reached the bunk. "So, you're on top," he finished smoothly as he rolled into his bunk. Ian watched in disbelief as Mickey tucked his hands behind his head and smiled coolly at him, temptingly licking his lips. As with any other reunion with Mickey, desire stirred deep in Ian's core, mingling with the burst of happiness expanding through his chest as he watched Mickey settle into the mattress. Mickey cradled the back of his head and just observed Ian, waiting for his move. Ian still felt so breathless and so sure he was dreaming that he had to look away. Noticing no one was at the door, everyone sent to their cells for count, Ian looked back to Mickey, a little surprised he was there. Seeing Mickey's beautiful face, untouched save for a couple of days' worth of stubble and the final remnants of an old sunburn, Ian couldn't contain his joy anymore and practically pounced on Mickey, taking one of his wrists in his hand, as Mickey liked. The thug just smiled up at him and watched as Ian took inventory of Mickey's face. He was perfect. No scars, no bruises, no scratches. Just as it should be. His eyes roved over Mickey's face, absorbing every detail as Mickey calmly did the same. The air around them thickened with intense relief and love as they simply gazed. Ian realized he was stroking Mickey's cheek and couldn't help but grin a little at the pure shock of it all. Mickey was here with him. He knew it was selfish, but judging by the look of complete adoration on Mickey's face, Ian knew that Mickey had no regrets. He leaned in a bit, and Mickey tilted his head, teasing, Mickey moved the hand that was still cradling his head to lay gently against the back of Ian's neck, fingertips playing lazily with the buzzed strands shaved in a straight line. It was so casual, so familiar. But it was so new, too, because, God, when was the last time Mickey played with his hair? He sucked back some emotion he did not want to express right now, and finally, after receiving the gentlest of nods from Mickey, laid his lips on his. The warmth of his lips, the gentle pressure from Mickey's hand at the back of Ian's neck, the way they breathed the same air. Ian could swear he could feel their bodies submerging into a shared space, a space where no one and nothing could ever separate them again. The kiss was gentle, and as they moved their lips against the others, Ian felt all of the pent-up loneliness and regret bubble up to the surface. Ian broke the kiss and rested his forehead against Mickey's. They breathed each other in and just lay pressed together for a long moment. Mickey sighed, or as close as Mickey would ever come to a sigh, and thread his fingers through the back of Ian's hair. "Ian," Mickey murmured into the quiet. "Yeah? Why the fuck are you trying to steal my look?" Ian collapsed on top of Mickey in a fit of laughter. Mickey started laughing too and lightly held Ian's arms as they laughed. Once Ian's breaths evened out, he pulled his face from Mickey's neck and grinned at him. Mickey's eyes were soft, but he looked sad. He was about to kiss Mickey again when Mickey sat up abruptly, eyes eyeing the door just as a guard passed. Ian released a breath and Mickey shrugged. "They don't really care, but if they're in a shitty mood or something, they might separate us," Mickey explained. Ian nodded. They adjusted themselves to sit on the mattress side by side and alternated between looking at each other and staring straight ahead. Finally, after a good 10 minutes of silence, Ian sighed and ran his fingers through his hair in exasperation. "I'll shave it as soon as it starts growing out," Ian promised. Mickey grimaced, but there was amusement there. Mickey carted his fingers through Ian's hair, ruffling it lightly, and Ian leaned his head against the cement wall. Mickey dropped his arm, but Ian caught it in his hand. Mickey's attention flashed to Ian's face as Ian took in the new tattoo. "Cartel," Mickey mumbled, in a way that suggested he didn't want to talk about it. Anger rose in him at Mickey for joining a cartel and putting his life in jeopardy. Mickey could have gotten himself fucking killed, a fucking white guy trying to infiltrate a Mexican drug operation. Ian knew enough about gang violence here in Chicago to know that the real cartels, the big boys, don't fucking play around. And yet, he'd survived, as he always does. Hell, he probably thrived. Ian shut down the anger, quickly realizing that, on top of Mickey being okay, he also had no right to pick on Mickey's career choices in Mexico when he hadn't exactly made any smart choices himself. Mickey was going to be pissed when he explained everything. They'd been sitting in silence for a long time before they looked at each other again. That electricity sparked once again, and Ian could feel Mickey, the essence of Mickey, pulling him in. They leaned in together, and this time neither of them initiated per se. They both leaned in. They both reached out, both cupped the other's jaw, and their lips met at the same time. Mickey, however, was the one to introduce his tongue first. Fuck. Ian groaned and returned it, but quickly drew back, leaving Mickey bereft. Fuck. Mickey breathed. Ian nodded in agreement. They were both panting a little. Mickey dropped his hand from Ian's face to lean back against the wall to catch his breath. "Tonight," Mickey stated simply. It wasn't a demand, but a declaration, and Ian heartily agreed. They looked at each other again, and both burst out laughing at their fucked-out expressions, but Ian quickly groaned at his semi-straining against the fabric. The way Mickey adjusted himself revealed he had a similar problem. "These uniforms don't hide fuck all, so Don't go walking around thinking about anything. The guys love making fun, and of course with who you are, it could make trouble for you, Mickey warned. Ian groaned. Fuck again. You saw? Ian guessed. He could hardly look Mickey in the eye. Mickey nodded, eyes hard. They showed your arrest down there, too. Slow news day, I guess. Or you pissed off the right people. More like. But before Ian could return the banter, the door screeched open. Must have done count with that guard who walked by. Oh, good, you're getting along, the guard drawled in what sounded like sarcastic relief. Dinner, he snapped, and both boys stood obediently. Gallagher, follow me. Milkovich, you know the drill. Mickey turned right, and Ian followed the guard off to the left. He fought to not look behind him, knowing now they had to be as DL as possible. Not even because Ian was afraid of being targeted per se, but because they could be targeted, and he didn't want to make anything easy for anyone who decided to target one to fuck with the other. It took a month or so to gather his support and holding, so the way he supposedly ran things before, that took time. But before, he had to keep a low profile, especially considering his high-profile arrest. Here, he needed to blend in as much as possible, not just for his sake, but now for Mickey's. They could handle themselves, but there was absolutely no reason to make things more difficult for them. He had someone else to look after this time. He followed the guard down the stairs and waited for him to open a locked door on the left side of the cafeteria social area. At the end of the long hallway, they took 2 rights and found 3 offices, the doors slightly open. At the second door, the guard stopped, prompting Ian to also stop. Your counselor is here. Talk for a few minutes and then someone will bring your meds before lights out. Ian nodded and shyly knocked at the mostly closed door. Enter, a medium-pitched, masculine voice called, and Ian reacted accordingly. The guard left them alone. The office's lights were dimmed with a couple of lamps softly illuminating the same cement walls as Ian was already growing accustomed to seeing. A chair of questionable comfort sat directly in front of the desk, which hid the body of a slightly balding auburn man. He looked friendly enough, but definitely held the air of, don't take me for granted or you won't like what you get instead. Gallagher? The man asked almost disinterestedly. Yeah, Ian mumbled awkwardly, picking at the pants of his uniform for something to do. Have a seat. The man laughed a bit. The silly endearment hinted in his tone. The perceived condescension almost made Ian roll his eyes, but he held on and simply took his seat. So, bipolar 1 with acute mania and psychotic features. He read off Ian's file. Ian nodded. So, that's what fed your gay Jesus delusion. Ian actually did roll his eyes this time. I wouldn't call it a delusion since I wasn't the one to pick that stuff out. People just started calling me that, and you went along with it and thought kidnapping a young teenager and setting his dad's van on fire was a normal reaction to people celebratizing you. Ian sighed. The whole thing got out of control, he allowed. Yeah, which explains why the delusion then continued when you were awaiting bail. Ian closed his eyes and didn't say anything. Well, this time around medication is a requirement for your plea deal, so have you resumed your meds since your release from our care? Yeah, I still had some left over when I stopped. Okay, and how long have you been taking them? About 2 weeks. Good, so worst of the side effects have worn off? Ian shrugged. Good. We do generic here, so your pills will look different and you may have a bit of your side effects return with the switch, but your dose will be the same, and it should work out about the same. If you have any issues with side effects or if you feel like they just stop working, let me know and we'll adjust them, okay? Ian nodded. My name is Dr. Wexford, and I will be here at various times throughout the day, and for emergencies, you can get a guard to give me a call, okay? Ian nodded again, eyebrows raised in surprise. A nurse will bring you your meds every morning and every evening. If you need to take them with food, you are responsible for doing that. If we find out you are selling or trading your meds or start refusing to take them, you will be in serious shit. Do you understand? Ian nodded. Good. We also have group therapy that I advise you attend. It's a combination group for mentally ill inmates and anger management to learn coping skills and the like for when you get out. It's a new program that I'm trying to get going to help you all with your transition when you leave, so I hope you find it beneficial. And I think that's it. Go on, get your dinner. I do take my meds with food, so then I guess you better go find the nurse with the drugs. He'll be dropping by each cell, so... Ian's eyes bugged out a little, and he bolted from the chair and was about to take off running when Dr. Wexford called, "Walk, Gallagher!" Ian rolled his eyes, but slowed to a shuffle. A guard had to open the door for him to re-enter the block, so all that being able to go talk to Dr. Wexford whenever he wanted was probably bullshit, Ian realized. When he emerged from the corridor, he spotted Mickey right away, casually saving a spot for Ian. Their eyes met, and Mickey's brows furrowed. Ian mouthed, "Meds," and Mickey nodded and turned to spot the guy in a gray uniform rolling a cart dishing out packets and cups to inmates. It looked like he hadn't made it to their cell, so Ian stood at the entrance to their room and waited for the man with the cart. As he waited, Ian just stared off into space, completely floored that this was happening like this. This was all too surreal. Not only was he in prison, but he was in here with Mickey. This had to be a do-over. A chance for him to make things right and do things how he should have the first time. Mickey seemed to forgive him, so this was a fresh start. From here on, he planned to treat Mickey the way he had always treated him. He vowed to put Mickey first for a change, and really try to make this work. The man in scrubs rolled to his door with his cart. "Gallagher, Ian," announced before the man had to double-check the roster. "Number 111080. Ian had to think back to intake, but he finally nodded. He passed Ian a small cup with 3 small white pills and a medium white one. The lithium was very different, but there were more pills, so he guessed that made up for the size difference. "I take them with food," Ian explained when the nurse stood there watching him. The nurse nodded and moved along. Ian placed his small cup of meds on the lip of the sink, planning to take them as soon as he finished eating, and walked back downstairs to get in line for dinner. As he passed Mickey's table, Mickey ever so slightly turned his head to watch him, and they briefly met gazes. Knowing that Mickey was watching his back filled Ian with relief that he'd never known. He knew he could take care of himself in here, but having Mickey to help, and finally being able to help Mickey in a scrape, made him feel the slightest bit better about the whole thing. Prison wouldn't just be survivable, it would be endurable. Terry hadn't been kidding about the subhuman quality slop they called food. The food had been pretty bad in Holding Block too, but somehow it still hadn't been quite this bad. This looked like a mound of ground meat of unidentifiable origin, with small bits of vegetables mixed in, a fruit cup which may or may not have been in date, and a barely in date carton of milk. He and Mickey were going to stock the fuck up on commissary food, it seemed. Ian made a mental note to ask Lip to see about setting up direct deposit from his savings to his commissary. Ian ignored a couple of remarks from people who recognized him as he wove his way over to the seat Mickey reserved for him. The guy sitting across from Mickey looked surprised and amused. "Bunky warmed up to you quick, Milkovich," the guy laughed, scooping a spoonful of fruit into his mouth and swallowing it whole. A technique Ian took note of. "He was bitch already? I figured a gay Jesus would be too pure to submit. Especially so quick." He laughed breathily. It was the most disturbing laugh Ian heard in a long time, and it took everything to stop his lip from curling up in discomfort and irritation. "Marcus," Mickey responded evenly. The guy looked up. "Shut the fuck up." His face was a chilling calm that forewarned a violent reaction should his request go unheeded. Marcus rolled his eyes and returned to his tray. Ian fought the urge to look at Mickey, not wanting to reaffirm the bitch comment, whether Marcus would have the balls to comment or not. They ate in silence for a tense minute before Mickey spoke again. "Who wanted to see you?" Ian turned to meet Mickey's curious gaze. "Oh, just a doc letting me know what services they provide." "Oh yeah, and what quality services they can provide since they feed us so fucking well." Marcus jumped in as Mickey opened his mouth. But Mickey laughed with him. "Must cut on the cost of this slop to afford these new bullshit programs." Marcus rolled his eyes resentfully. Ian grinned, just to feel like he fit in, but he was quickly feeling like he stepped into something. "So you got the spiel that you can't work, but can work out once a day and otherwise sit around bored out of your mind, that right?" Mickey guessed before choking down a chunk of meat mound. "Not exactly. Told me about group therapy. Said it was new and thought I could benefit." "Snitching circle? He told you to go there?" Marcus interrupted. Ian shrugged, rolled his eyes, and choked his own mouthful of food down, fighting it through his gag reflex. Mickey gave a wry smile that communicated his wish to comfort Ian through the experience. "Yeah, they tried to get me to do that shit too. Said I could use some anger management skills." Marcus laughed with another eye roll. He was mostly poking at the meat remaining on his tray, but never raised another forkful to his mouth. "You gonna do it?" Mickey asked warily. Ian met his eyes to weigh what he was trying to convey in the look. Ian was out of practice of reading Mickey's eyes, so he couldn't really tell what he was trying to communicate. There wasn't a warning to keep his mouth shut, but he didn't look comfortable either. "It didn't sound like I had much of a choice, honestly," Ian finally responded slowly. "Who would have thought a gay Jesus would freak out the bigwigs enough to force group therapy on him?" Marcus griped, impressed. Ian had to fight his urge to prove just how intimidating gay Jesus could be. He was already getting tired of this prick's assumptions that he was a fucking fairy or some shit. A sweet little twink who wasn't capable of taking care of himself in here. Back in holding, Ian fucking ran the place. And fuck, did he want to prove that here and now? But Ian didn't even need to turn to see Mickey's warning stare to know that would be stupid. He didn't want to play up his threat, but he didn't want to be seen as an easy target either. He also didn't want to tempt the ignorance of someone with no understanding of mental illness and make himself a target for that reason. Basically, Ian was fucking stuck, and based on Mickey's look in his eyes, he was thinking the same thing. Finally, Ian smiled. "Guess I did something big, huh?" "Apparently so," Marcus grinned. It was a cold smile that made Ian feel like he said the absolute wrong thing. He looked to Mickey to gauge his reaction, but Mickey had the perfect poker face, and he said nothing. From there, Marcus jumped into explaining some of the bigger dudes in here that gay Jesus would do well to avoid for one reason or another. Homophobe, enjoys collecting prison bitches, may want to establish respect and beat down Ian's celebrity status, etc. It wasn't as though he hadn't considered any of this shit, and it wasn't as though he didn't face the same risks back in holding, but some of the shit Marcus talked about hinted that word had spread about Ian's respectful bunkie relationship standoff at the other block, and that he may have intrigued some guys. Great. Mickey absorbed this information and outwardly took this news with a grain of salt, laughing at some of the names of the guys who apparently thought they could take gay Jesus on. But even as Mickey laughed, he didn't try to build Ian's rep up or anything. He didn't add any commentary or insult the guy Marcus named, just let the name drift away to imply he was unconcerned enough to not engage. Ian followed Mickey's lead and just shrugged when Marcus asked if Ian was worried. "A little Twinkie like you thinks you can take these fuckers on?" Marcus challenged, dark smile still placed confidently on his face. Ian looked to Mickey, which he probably shouldn't have done, but he really didn't know what to say here. I guess I'm just hoping it won't come to that, Ian replied diplomatically. Marcus nodded. Show respect, you'll be fine, Marcus finally said, and Ian suddenly remembered the last time he'd heard that at age 16 in that group home. It was an easy enough lesson to learn, but not always with a set of rules that were easy to follow. At the group home, he'd had Lip to protect him, and Mickey to explain how to play it. Here, he had Mickey with him, and as intimidating as Marcus tried to be, Ian got the impression that Mickey was the alpha between the two of them, and he genuinely didn't have anything to worry about. He hoped. The door slammed shut behind them as Ian reached for his cup of pills, still sitting on the sink. Mickey must have acquired a cup at some point before Ian got here, because they weren't issued one at intake, but there was a short, plastic, beige cup resting on the opposite side of the sink from his pills. You went off him, huh? Mickey accused, but his tone was gentle. Ian filled the cup with water from the sink, his stomach roiling as he tried not to think about how dirty this water likely was, and turned to him. Mickey's gaze was wary, anxiously awaiting Ian's answer. Finally, Ian nodded. Mickey's eyes hardened in further accusation. When? He demanded. His voice sounded tight, and Ian couldn't tell if it was in anger or something else. Ian put the cup of water and pills back on the sink and leaned back against it. About 4 months after Monica died, Ian answered plainly, factually. Mickey's eyes bust open, and he gawked. She died? When? How? Ian nodded, and his heart broke for Mickey, who looked so lost as to how to react. Mickey seemed to wrestle with wanting to comfort him, and the remaining justified anger at Ian. Mickey, being so lost at what to do, broke Ian's heart because, as long as he could remember, if there was nothing else Mickey was sure about, it had always been how to comfort an Ian Gallagher in distress. You okay now? Ian smiled a little and stepped forward, brushing Mickey's arms with his fingertips, testing Mickey's reaction. When he didn't jerk away, Ian took Mickey's hand in his and squeezed. Yeah, I'm all good now. It was rough at first, and no one else really gave a shit, so I was pretty much on my own with the grieving thing, but I'm alright now. You went off your meds, Ian. That's not all good, Mickey replied harshly, but he still didn't rip his hand away. And I'm back on them now, so yeah, I'm doing all right again, I promise. He ensured they maintained eye contact as he said it. He needed Mickey to understand that, as off the rails as Ian went, he was railing himself again. He was going the right direction, jail besides. Mickey blew out a harsh breath and sat on the bunk, gently disentangling their fingers. He dropped his head into his hand and stayed there, folded over for a long moment. Are you only on them because the court made you? Mickey demanded. Ian released all the air in his lungs and looked down at his shoes. That's why I got back on them, he admitted. But now that I'm back on them, thinking clearly, I know I need to stay on them. Once again, they had maintained eye contact, but Mickey averted his soon after Ian was done speaking in what looked like resentment. Ian's heart fractured even more seeing that look on Mickey's face, and yet he knew deep down that he deserved it. He turned around and grabbed both cups again. Ian swallowed his medicine one pill at a time, standing directly in front of Mickey, who only looked up to watch Ian swallow the last two. See? I'm taking responsibility. I'm not fucking around with this. I'm doing what I have to do. I'll be that person who had his shit together again. I'll just have a bit more baggage than before, but Ian needed Mickey to know that the person Ian became while Mickey was locked up in prison the last time, that person he shoved in Mickey's face when he claimed to have his shit together, Mickey deserved Ian when he was that person. The person who had the capability of paying Mickey the attention he deserved. The Ian who could spoil the fuck out of Mickey even though Mickey was too low-key of a person to really want any of it. Now that he knew who he was capable of being, on his meds and with the right things going for him, he wanted that for himself again and wanted to be that person for Mickey. Mickey nodded, sniffled, and stiffly lay down against the wall, leaving plenty of space for Ian to crawl in after him. Ian settled facing Mickey, back to the door, and they watched each other warily. It reminded him of when Mickey returned to him after 2 days of not being able to face him when he came out of the hospital. Mickey had been so apologetic, so fucking sorry for not being there when he was released or answering his calls. Ian had forgiven him immediately, of course. He didn't even see anything to forgive at the time, and he still didn't really. He'd just been grateful Mickey came back. That was what had mattered. Mickey always came back. He knew deep down he couldn't rely on that forever, but for now he was grateful this was the case, so they could have another chance. Surely the last, Ian admitted to himself. He was about to lean in to kiss Mickey when the signal for count came on. Mickey sighed in aggravation, his eyes closing tight. Ian stroked Mickey's face for a too brief moment and rolled back off Mickey's bunk to make his own. He really should have made his bed before dinner, because now he really didn't want to, but he had been so blown away by Mickey being here that he didn't even really think about it until now. He pulled the sheets and pillow out of the mesh sack they gave him at intake and worked quickly to tuck the sheets around the mattress, struggling with the back corner. Mickey didn't move a muscle as Ian worked, so Ian assumed he was lost in thought. Today was probably a big day for Mickey too, Ian realized. The guard walked by just as Ian finished tucking his blanket around the bottom left corner and reached for the pillow. Lights out should be in 5 minutes. We're at the back of count, so it ain't long after we see a guard cross, Mickey explained from the bottom bunk. Ian nodded, even though Mickey wasn't looking at him and wouldn't be able to see him even if he was. Ian hoisted himself to the top bunk and rested on his back, staring up at the ceiling absently. It was the most silent they'd been since he got here, because even when they had been quiet earlier, it was like at least they were looking at each other, or their fingers were threaded together. This silence was heavy, not quite suffocating, but it was uncomfortable. You were on your meds when you came with me to Mexico? Mickey asked from below Ian, who started at Mickey's sudden question. He sank into the mattress, the nylon crinkling as he fidgeted. Yeah, I was. Not one sound permeated from the bottom bunk until 5 minutes after the lights clicked out. Your grandpa ass pass out, Gallagher? Ian couldn't help but laugh at relief. Mickey wasn't that mad at him then. They just had some shit to discuss. Just didn't know if you were still down, he admitted, sitting up. Have I ever turned you down before? Mickey griped. Ian smirked because, no, Mickey had not. His power bottom had the stamina to keep up with Ian's hypersexually manic ass for the 4 months he was on that high, with some to spare. When will another guard be due? Ian asked, swinging his body around to prep for the drop to the ground. Not for a couple hours, but I mean it when I said they don't give a shit. Since no one's walking around with blue balls, it keeps the prisoners happy, so the guards don't care as long as it's kept in the cells during lights out, when they can pretend they don't see anything. Ian nodded to himself, accepting the logic, and vaulted over the edge to drop to the floor. Mickey sat up and started pulling at the buttons of his jumpsuit. Ian dove to the bottom bunk and picked up the task. Mickey kissed Ian forcefully, and also reached out to attack the buttons on Ian's uniform. Ian introduced his tongue first this time, cradling the back of Mickey's head with one hand for leverage. Mickey groaned and met his tongue with his own, stealing Ian's breath as they kissed. He released the back of Mickey's head to return his fingers to unfastening the remaining buttons. They wasted no time when Mickey's buttons were all undone, and together they tore at the material on Mickey's shoulders, shoving the fabric to his waist. Before Ian could continue pulling on Mickey's uniform, Mickey started tearing at the shoulders of Ian's, and before he knew it, they pulled his whole uniform off. As Ian flung off the rest of his underclothes, Mickey finished stripping himself and leaned back. Ian took Mickey in, but not at all like how he did earlier, examining Mickey's face. That was relief and excitement. This was fucking carnal. They reached for each other at the same time, but Mickey pulled Ian into him, laying them both back as their lips sealed together. Ian leaned on one arm to keep most of his weight off Mickey, but the other hand explored frantically, cupping Mickey's jaw, then trailing down his chest to grip at his hip, brushing back up his abdomen to caress his face, and quickly running back down his chest to once again grasp his hip. Mickey's hands remained clasped around the back of Ian's neck and on his shoulder, but he responded to every single touch, tilting his hip and rocking into Ian as the redhead's hand explored. Mickey released the kiss first, to gasp for breath, and Ian sank his head into Mickey's neck to kiss and likely suck. Mickey threw his head back and sank into the mattress. As Ian wrapped his hand around Mickey's shaft, though, the brunette's body tightened. Ian slid low, down Mickey's body, and quickly, without giving either of them a chance to think or breathe, he swallowed Mickey down and set a steady rhythm. Mickey struggled to hold in his moan as Ian set to work, somehow managing to release a steady stream of breath and curl his fingers in Ian's hair. Too soon, though, Ian released the other man's cock and trailed down again. Mickey grinned breathlessly and propped his legs up for Ian just as his tongue met the ring of muscle. Ian groaned as he caressed Mickey's opening with his tongue, carefully and teasingly opening him up. Mickey gasped as Ian's tongue slipped into him. His hips lifted a little, giving Ian better access as he stroked Mickey's opening with his tongue. The sensation set Mickey's eyes rolling to the back of his head, and Ian grinned as he watched, to the best of his ability, Mickey unravel beneath him. "Fuck, Ian," he groaned softly. Ian chuckled darkly as he thrust his tongue even deeper. Mickey gasped, but otherwise remained completely still as Ian fucked him with his tongue, accepting all Ian was willing to give. The gravity of this moment settled over the both of them like the warmest blanket on the coldest day. All while Ian worked on Mickey, and they exchanged small glances and smiles. Mickey caressed Ian's face or hair, and Ian intertwined his fingers with Mickey's. This was where they were safe. This was where they both had always been safe, from the very beginning. Ian gently slipped out of Mickey, licked up his shaft one more time, and settled over him. He gently stroked his cheek and locked gazes with him. The abundant love in Mickey's eyes damn near choked Ian as he was consumed by Mickey's love for him. Mickey spread his legs ever so slightly to remind Ian what he was there to do, and Ian wrapped a hand around Mickey's thighs, guiding it up his waist, where Mickey then draped his leg over Ian's hip. He released his thigh and reached between them to slowly sink one finger inside Mickey. The brunette's eyes fluttered shut as he absorbed the sensation of Ian entering him and rocked back on the finger. With one going so easily, Ian teased Mickey's opening with the second finger and slowly allowed that one to join the first. A small noise gasped from Mickey's throat, and he clutched to Ian. Ian was prepared to back off, but he quickly realized that this wasn't a painful noise or action. Mickey was absorbing the experience, feeling everything they were doing. Mickey often went to this place when they were together. Ian had noticed it long before they were officially a couple. At first, he had believed Mickey was pretending he wasn't fucking a dude, because he was so terrified of being gay. But once they were officially together and Mickey didn't flip out anymore when Ian referenced what they did as making love, Ian realized that this thing Mickey does, that thing where he closes his eyes, sinks into the mattress, and opens himself in the most vulnerable way, this thing Was Mickey truly living in the moment and appreciating what they were doing? It almost looked like Mickey was having some sort of religious moment whenever they were joined. And it struck Ian now just how profound it was that after all of this time, Mickey still got that same look on his face, even just from fingering him open. Mickey had winced a little bit at the third finger, so Ian slowed down and allowed Mickey to relax, to accept him in order to fully prepare. As soon as Mickey bit his lip and arched into Ian, he withdrew, and the whine that burst from Mickey's chest almost made Ian laugh. Almost. As adorable as Mickey was about 90% of the time, he was only adorable when Ian didn't let on how adorable he was being. And Ian was really loving this moment, so getting Mickey up in arms about his vulnerability was simply not an option right now. Ian did chance a grin, though, as Mickey opened his eyes to gaze at Ian as he entered him. Ian tipped his forehead against Mickey's as he bottomed out, and they both released a joined breath of what felt like reverence. They stayed joined for a long moment before Ian kissed Mickey's cheek and slowly retreated, then snapped his hips forward. Mickey sighed and tilted his hips up to accept Ian's next thrust and pinned his legs solidly against Ian's sides. Ian tucked his face into Mickey's neck, holding himself up by his elbows as he gradually sped his thrusts, Mickey lightly grunting every time they reconnected. Their pants and sighs filled the air, and Ian felt a provocative shell envelop them as they absorbed each other. It was like coming home, being with Mickey again. He had missed him even more than he realized, and as he fought back some embarrassingly strong emotion, Ian knew that he couldn't possibly fuck this up again. Mickey was his ride or die, and he had taken Mickey's loyalty for granted too many times. He raised up from his elbows to his hands and picked up the power behind his thrusts. Mickey tossed his head to the side and clenched his eyes shut, biting his bottom lip as a loud moan almost burst from him. Ian laughed a throaty laugh, but Mickey didn't seem to hear. His brows creased as he seemed to focus intently on wrapping as much of himself around Ian as possible, throwing his legs around Ian's waist and his arms around Ian's neck. Ian lowered himself once again, feeling instinctually that Mickey was close. Ian, Mickey groaned as his fingernails dug into Ian's shoulders. Ian panted out a heavy breath and kissed Mickey's jaw. Close? Ian asked. Mickey nodded fervently. Gonna go untouched? Mickey's eyes opened, and he looked desperately up at Ian. Your call, man, Mickey finally said, letting his legs slip back down to simply cradling Ian's sides. Ian looped his arms around the backs of Mickey's thighs, propping them higher and thrusting deeper and deeper. Mickey's mouth burst open, and thankfully, no sound came out, but Ian was already shushing him. Mickey laughed a little, and he tugged at his own hair as he continued taking what Ian was giving, visibly struggling to keep quiet. Close, Mick, Ian warned. Mickey wrapped his arms back around Ian's neck and thrust his fingers into Ian's hair as he brought their faces close together. Go, Mickey grunted through gritted teeth. Mickey came first as Ian delivered another powerful thrust, and the tightening of Mickey's ass brought him to his own climax. It was several moments after his hips stopped before he realized they'd both bitten each other's shoulders in the effort to keep quiet. Ian slowly closed his mouth, gently removing his teeth from Mickey's shoulder, and laid a gentle kiss against the ridges in his skin. Mickey also freed Ian's shoulder and released a deep breath as he continued to cling to Ian. They stay like that for a long, long time, Ian buried deep inside Mickey, Mickey's legs pinned tightly against Ian's sides, toes curled against his thighs. Mickey's arms wrapped securely around Ian's shoulders, and Ian supporting the both of them as much as possible. Ian's arms started to buckle, though, and he slowly snaked an arm around Mickey's back as he lowered himself on top of him. After a long moment of silence, Ian finally withdrew from Mickey, who barely even reacted to Ian's actions. So much for calling me Grandpa, Ian laughed to himself as Mickey settled into the mattress, looking like he was already mostly asleep. Hey, come on, man, we can't be caught like this. Ian shook him gently. Mickey grumbled groggily in agreement and sat up, but there was a resentful huff as he did so. Ian chuckled to himself as he too sat up and gathered his clothes. They stuck to the prison-issued boxers and their t-shirts, but folded their jumpsuits to pull on tomorrow. Still standing, Ian took Mickey's hand in his, encouraging him to look up at him. When Mickey did meet his gaze, Ian smiled warmly on instinct. What they just did reminded him of so many passionate nights at the Milkovich house when they made love damn near every night. Though they tried their hardest to replicate this feeling on the blanket out in the desert, there was only so much they could do on that hard and unforgiving ground. Though this was still not ideal, this was the closest they'd come to being together in a normal way, and fuck, had it really already been 3 years? He cupped Mickey's cheek and drew him in. Mickey went willingly, and their lips met for a soft and sweet kiss. I love you, Mick, Ian sighed as their lips parted. Mickey watched Ian intently for a long, long moment, stirring Ian's anxiety as he awaited Mickey's answer. I love you too, Ian, he breathed in return. Ian released a breath of relief and grinned broadly. Mickey's face didn't reflect a similar feeling, though, and anxiety ignited Ian's stomach again. I guess we should go to sleep, huh? Ian suggested to break the slight awkwardness that slipped over them. Mickey finally averted his eyes from Ian's and nodded. Yeah, they'd get us up early as fuck, so probably should. Neither of them moved, even though standing there like this was awkward as fuck. With the tips of his fingers, Ian lightly turned Mickey's attention back to him and kissed him one more time. Mickey allowed all of this with absolutely no resistance, but it still didn't make Ian feel any better about this sudden shift in demeanor. Mickey broke away first and rolled into his bunk, leaving Ian standing alone in the center of their cell. He stared after Mickey for a long moment, wondering what the fuck happened, but he couldn't gather the courage to say anything. He went to the sink, grabbed the toothbrush and tiny tube of toothpaste from the mesh bag, and brushed his teeth for something to focus on until he could settle his stomach. Beside him, Mickey was laying completely still, and when Ian turned slightly to look at him, his eyes were completely open, and he was observing the underside of the top bunk, as though it was the most fascinating thing about this place. He brushed his teeth longer than probably necessary, but he needed to do something with his hands, and he knew that once he lay down, he would have to be still for the remainder of the night to allow Mickey to sleep. He rinsed his mouth out, rinsed the brush, and replaced the brush and tube of toothpaste in the mesh bag. He quickly scaled the bunk bed and climbed into his bunk. He lay on his side, fighting the feeling of apprehension and worry, reminding himself that this whole experience was probably more emotion than Mickey was accustomed to processing, and he probably just needed to check out for a bit. Yeah, that was it. Still, the look on Mickey's face had filled Ian with the feeling that something was definitely wrong. Good night, Mick, Ian whispered into the still quiet. Nothing sounded from the bunk below. End of chapter 1. Okay, so author's note time. I really hope this isn't the cringiest thing ever, but I heard that this is a thing that people are doing, either reading their favorite fics and putting it on YouTube, or reading their own fics and putting it on YouTube. And I don't know, I've been wanting to get back to writing Contained but Unrestrained. I've missed it, and I still sometimes get people asking after it, so I know that there are at least a few people who still love it as much as I do. So I figured this might be a good way to kind of get back in the swing of working on it. So I don't know how often I'll be updating, maybe one a week or something, and if any loyal readers want to have me read another one of my stories, I'm more than happy to do that as well. Or if this is the most cringiest thing that has ever happened, then that's okay, and I will naturally stop. So, quick author's note about this chapter. I remember when I first uploaded it, I got a lot of comments talking about how dangerous it is to have anal sex with only saliva, and I just wanted to acknowledge that here. I am aware of that. I was willing to bend the realm of reality for the sake of them having a, a good first reunion together. Plus, I have read accounts of some gay men who describe themselves as power bottoms, as eventually not needing lube in the same way that they used to. I don't know if there's any scientific validity to that, but I have read accounts of people claiming that. And as we saw in canon for, I think it was season 11, Mickey claims to not like lube. And yeah, I don't know. That it's a pitiful excuse. Plus, I wrote this before season 11, but still, there you have it. So I think that's all the author's notes I had. Let me know if you liked it. Let me know if this is the cringiest thing you've ever seen or heard. And yeah, we'll see how it goes.